we've already mentioned, or other people have already mentioned, the 5 areas that are in the sanctions that the Obama administration temporarily lifted in January 2017. And I'm just going to run through those real quickly and then address my views on if those are valid rationale, and then try to focus on some recommendations for Congress and the Trump administration. First, on the issue of enhancing cooperation on counterterrorism. I have to say, I think that my view is probably simplistic, and I know it's hard line, but the sins of Bashir and the regime, I just don't see how those sins can be forgiven. They hosted al-Qaeda for several years. Attacks occurred on our embassies in Tanzania and Kenya. I mean, thousands of American lives have been ended because of Khartoum and Bashir's material support for terrorism. And this isn't even half the story on their support for terrorism. They need to be held accountable. You said at the beginning of this hearing in your opening remarks, you've held countless hearings on human rights, peace, I mean, coming on 15, 20 years. And so when are they going to be held accountable for these acts? And it's not like it's just another dictatorship around the world. I mean, these are people who are still in power, some out of power, who are anti-American, anti-Western, and their actions have had an impact that are diametrically opposed to the interests of this country. So the first thing is, I know it's simplistic, but I think that lifting the sanctions for cooperation on counterterrorism is not forgivable. And I think that they need to be held accountable for their actions. The nature of this regime in Khartoum is that they kill their own people. And they kill their own citizens. They don't even blink when they do it. They didn't blink when they were supporting terrorism or whatever they're still doing or not doing. And they haven't blinked in killing women and children intentionally. Particularly what I know about is in the Nuba Mountains. Dropping bombs on schools, hospitals, churches. I've seen them. There are holes in the roofs. Every school, every hut has a foxhole in it so that the children or the pastor or priest can run and hide into a foxhole. Imagine. I mean, I was going to try to bring in some shrapnel from these bombs that have exploded and that have killed innocent people. And I didn't want to bring it in because I didn't know if I'd be able to get it through and have the hassle of it. But I've got them. The bombs drop, and if you're not in a foxhole, and you're within 100, 200 meters of this thing, it's going to spin hundreds of miles an hour, and it's going to cut off your head, cut off your arm, go right through you. So, I mean, that's the reality of what they're doing to their own people, and that's the reality of the nature of this regime. They're still in power. And I know it's a simplistic view, but that's the reality of what they have been doing up until very recently, and they can do again, into their own citizens. On the issue of humanitarian access, particularly in the 2 areas, to my knowledge, Khartoum has not allowed a single piece of humanitarian assistance into the 2 areas. People haven't planted crops like they would when there's peace and stability. The people of Nuba have been attacked and invaded for over 6 years now, since 2011. It's a war zone. So there's little food, there's no development, there's no building for the future. There are virtually no doctors. There's 1 surgeon in the Nuba Mountains. Woe to you if you get appendicitis and you can't reach Dr. Tom Katina, an American, serving at Goodell Hospital. The humanitarian situation, particularly in the 2 areas, which I know about, is dire. And it's part of Khartoum's strategy, just like it was in the war with South Sudan, to deny the 2 areas humanitarian assistance. I will say this, I'll acknowledge one positive thing that I've seen Khartoum do, and that is, in an ironic twist, they've allowed in South Sudanese 100, 200,000 refugees and they have a semblance of safety there. And as well, there are, I think, between 100 and 200,000 Eritreans who have fled the repressive regime in Eritrea. Now, Khartoum's doing this because it's in their interest. I don't think they're doing it because they think it's the right thing to do, but ascribing motives is neither here nor there. And the thing is, though, that they are, I think, using, particularly with the Eritrean issue, you're using this with the Europeans to stem the refugee flow and getting money and funding to keep the refugees in Sudan. So I think that they're gaining some benefit out of it as well. In the past several months, hostilities in the two areas has been greatly reduced. The aerial bombing, to my knowledge, has ceased. No major offenses or skirmishes or on any sort of scale have occurred. And both sides, the major sides involved, Khartoum and the SPLM North, have restrained. However, there's no formal ceasefire. There are no mechanisms to enforce the ceasefire, no modalities, no observers, so except for maybe the United States with these sanctions that we've used as leverage. And the fighting and bombing can begin at a moment's notice. The comprehensive peace agreement, I need to touch on that because we keep having hearings and talking about Sudan, particularly as it concerns the two areas. Khartoum did allow the vote, South Sudan to vote for independence. But on many other aspects of the CPA, they just clearly violated the CPA, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement of 2005. In May 2011, Khartoum invaded Abyei, destroying, killing, looting, displacing over 100,000 Dinka who are indigenous to Abyei. And now there's an Ethiopian peacekeeping force there preventing any further outbreaks, hopefully. But that was a Khartoum clear violation of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, and it included violence. The CPA provided for a popular consultation for the two areas. Abyei was promised a referendum. The citizens of Abyei, as we all know, were promised a referendum to decide which country they belong in. That hasn't happened. But the CPA provided for a popular consultation for the people of the two areas. That hasn't happened. Instead, what happened? In May 2011, Bashir gave the SPLM North 1 week to disarm their army. And my understanding was the CPA provided for 1 year to integrate security and get security arrangements figured out between the SPLM North and Khartoum. Instead, it was 1 week, and then Bashir and his allies attacked and resumed the civil war, which has been going on within Khartoum and the two areas for almost 6 years now. From personal experience, the CPA provided for political participation and freedom of movement and assembly. When I was in Khartoum in 2009, when I was a staff member of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, several members of the transitional government, the National Assembly, were marching up in a peaceful protest on the steps of the Assembly to present their problems and their issues with the way the government was going. As we were going out to the refugee camps, we saw thousands of Interior Ministry troops coming the other way. And we learned later that the security forces had arrested these National Assembly members, beaten them up, kicked them, and we saw the bruises and we saw the impact upon this. And this was the beginning of the end of, to me, in my mind, of the implementation of the CPA, particularly regarded the two areas. Okay, so what are my recommendations for the new administration and for Congress? First, President Trump needs to appoint a high-level special envoy for Sudan and South Sudan. This person needs to have direct access to President Trump. The appointment ceremony should occur in the Rose Garden. President Trump should conduct a press conference. In his remarks, he should note the expectation that the special envoy should travel to the Nuba Mountains, the two areas, Khartoum, Darfur, Juba, South Sudan, and Sudan. To my knowledge, correct me if I'm wrong, Ambassador Lyman, no special envoys ever traveled to the two areas to see for themselves the situation on the ground. I believe they've gone to Khartoum, but they've never gone to the two areas. This needs to change. Second, the Trump administration needs to reset relations with South Sudan. Yes, South Sudan. As a signatory to the CPA and as a major stakeholder in the creation of South Sudan, the United States has a moral obligation to help the South move off the precipice of total collapse. And President Trump having a personal relationship with President Salva Kiir might help to improve the conditions in South Sudan and the region. Despite being two independent countries, Sudan and South Sudan's future are linked, and solutions to both political and civil war crises must be found. And it's in America's strategic and moral interest to bring peace and stability to the region and to these two countries. Third, within 6 months of today, President Trump should hold a regional conference in Washington, D.C. and invite and have attend President Salva Kiir, President of Uganda, President of Kenya, Prime Minister of Ethiopia, maybe a few others. Promote a unified agenda for peace, democracy, stability, and security in the region, and finding unified approaches to the problems in Sudan and South Sudan. Fourth, working with Congress, President Trump should either amend the January 2017 executive order lifting some sanctions, or ask Congress, the President should ask Congress to draft legislation, or you should just draft it on your own, concerning sanctions on Sudan. President Trump or legislation should make the lifting of sanctions reviewable every 180 days or annually, as you suggested earlier. And there should be a requirement the executive branch must submit to Congress in writing and to the President a rationale and review for action on sanctions towards Sudan. Such a review should be publicly viewable 2 months before the sanctions should be lifted. And it should be written such that the sanctions are not automatically lifted if the President doesn't take action, like they are right now. These sanctions, my understanding, will be automatically lifted unless the President revokes them or does something to them. The stoppage in the fighting in the two areas has been a positive development and needs to be sustained. And the sustained lull can create an environment and a situation more conducive to a lasting peace. Now, it begs the question as to why Khartoum has to do something in their own interest, in the sense of making a peace deal and ceasing to fight and kill its own people. But if a few select sanctions can be waived for 180 days or a year, and it keeps the fighting down and they're negotiating good interests, I think it's worth trying. Fifth, the chairman of the full committee, ranking member, chairman, other members should request a classified briefing from relevant agencies on Sudan's counterterrorism assistance to the United States. In that same briefing, the agencies should provide a report detailing the involvement of Khartoum and the extent of Khartoum's meddling and past activity and present activity in South Sudan and the region. After receiving this briefing, then you could ask those agencies to give the same briefing to other members of the committee and other members in the Senate and the Congress. I want to give President Trump and his team an opportunity to build on the fact that the fighting in the two areas has ceased, and the fighting can begin at a moment's notice. The region's waiting to see how President Trump will lead in the new Congress, will lead and amend, change direction, or build upon the work from previous administrations. We want to give President Trump the ability to lead in this volatile region, and I believe that limiting some of the sanctions and limiting them for a little bit of time could lead to certain transparent, reviewable, and a certifiable process that involves the Congress and congressional approval and might provide leverage and better behavior from Khartoum. My hope is for the President to become personally engaged in the peace process in the Sudans, and for the President to develop a personal relationship with our allies in the region. I believe it's in the interests of the United States. I believe it's in the security interests of the United States to use the resources and levers of American power to promote peace and prosperity and freedom in this troubled region.